Hi everyone. This month I'm speaking to Kavya Raj about her work with problematic internet use. Kavya, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Everyone uses the internet as far as I know. So what is problematic internet use, given that people who are watching this now will be using the internet to see?
Really, really good question. So it's something actually, my research, my PhD looked at the internet, and it was a question that came up a lot was, am I using it problematically? Is using it at all problematic? And I'm going to give you the quintessential scientist answer, which is there's still debate on what actually makes it problematic. So
it's not hours per day, for instance, or minutes per day?
No, so that's a really interesting thing. That was a line of thinking in the scientific community. But the more we looked into it, the more that we realized actually there's a really big discrepancy between how many hours people are spending on the internet. And it's less about the time, and it's more about the level of control and how much that behavior impacts the rest of our life. Does me being online impact the rest of my life, my work, my friends, my relationships, my mental health, my sleep? Is it impacting those things in a negative way?
So tell us about the impacts. What is the dark side of overuse of the internet?
Yeah, unfortunately, the things that we see is it's really widespread. That's kind of the scary bit, is we see that it does have quite serious impacts on people's sleep. And so as you can imagine, people staying up later, just not having as many hours to sleep as they could. We see that it affects their mood. And we see things like worsened symptoms of depression and anxiety and stress. We see that it impacts people's level of loneliness. And we also see that, really concerningly, it can impact your professional relationships and your personal relationships. Pretty much every major domain of life, we see some kind of negative consequence when you start hitting that severe end of problematic internet use.
And we can't really ignore it because the internet is integral now to, well, if not 8 billion people, to many people in many modern societies. It's our banking, it's our entertainment, it's how we can contact each other, it's how we share information, it's work and leisure. We can't avoid it.
No, exactly. It's, not spending time on the internet or cutting ourselves off from it isn't really a feasible option.
Right.
And so the question then becomes, well, we have access to this thing all the time through our phones, our computers, all of our devices in our homes are connected to the internet. How do we form a relationship with this technology so that we can engage with it in a healthy manner? Because it's around us all the time. That's really the question.
So you have to choose a target audience for any behavioural intervention. Where do you start? Where did you start?
For me, I come from a psychology background. I was always really interested in the mental health side. When you start diving into the literature, what we see is, kind of unsurprisingly, it affects young people more than any other type of adult. And so much of what they do is online. You have to access the internet to be able to engage in your studies, but you also have to access the internet to socialise with your peers.
Right.
And so it's both functional tool and potential problem wrapped up together.
Right.
So the more I went into the literature, the more I started to see, actually, this is really affecting young people, particularly students. And so based on the scope of the issue, I started sort of narrowing down to look at students really specifically.
Instead of saying we're going to fix everyone a little bit, you really have to focus in on a target audience.
Yeah, you really do. If you restrict your focus and you do a good job of following a scientific process for that, you're more likely to have a bigger impact, because the tighter your audience is defined, the more specific you can focus your research and your treatments and things on that particular group.
Right.
And what works for them rather than what works for everybody, because we're all too different for that to work.
So tell us about the Mindful Media Project.
It came about from these questions that you're asking, right? Who is this affecting? What kind of audience group do we see is really experiencing this, and how can we help? And so as I went about it, we started looking more and more at students, particularly university students, because they're at this sort of bridge point of their life where often, it's their first time out of home. They are largely in control of their own time for the first time in their whole lives. And what happens at university could have really major consequences for the rest of their professional career. So that's where we started. And when we looked at the treatment options that were available to them, it was kind of just the stock standard mental health lines of treatment, which is pharmacotherapy, so some type of medication, or psychotherapy, so some form of talk therapy, or a combination of the two. And these are really great treatment options for a lot of mental health conditions, and they can be really powerful. But it's sort of the general line of treatment for all conditions. It's not specific to this particular behaviour. What we see is that the more that the behaviour worsens, the more difficult it is to regulate that behaviour.
Right.
So much of what we do is we have an emotion or we have a thought, and a behaviour is automatically triggered. It's
Right.
that automatic part that's really key. And so, perhaps I feel this sense of stress, something, I get an email, that email triggers an immediate emotional reaction and physical reaction of stress. And I think, oh my God, I can't deal with this. And without really realizing, I have behaved by picking up my phone and gone straight to Facebook to try and disengage.
Yeah.
Right? The idea is that through mindfulness, you actually become more aware of that entire process.
Yeah.
So then the question of the intervention becomes, how do I get people to do this behavior consistently enough and for long enough to see the benefits that I want to see?
And overcome the barriers of meditation is a hippie thing, or it's a
Exactly.
religious thing that
Yeah.
I don't have a tradition of, or
Yeah.
don't understand.
Yeah, exactly. So the way that we do it from a behavioral science perspective is you identify your audience, you identify the behavior. For us, the behavior was we needed people to practice a set type of mindfulness meditation every day for 10 minutes a day for a month. We all know exercise is great for us. We all know that we should be doing it.
But it's hard.
But it's hard, and there's a lot of things that stop us from doing it. And so it was, okay, well, what are the barriers? You already mentioned, people find it a bit hippy-dippy, totally fair. It's based in a spiritual tradition. I might not be from that spiritual tradition. I might not be from that religion. Can I do this?
But if you reframed it as this is what the top sports people in the world do, people are going, oh yeah, it works.
Yeah.
I don't have to shave my head or become a monk or any of that sort of stuff to do this. Control of the mind actually works.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what you're talking about there is a behavior change technique.
Right.
So, if the barrier that people are facing is this sense of social shame or, I don't really feel motivated because I don't see people in my social group doing this, or I don't think this is socially normal.
Yeah.
You can take the technique to change that barrier is persuasion, by taking a really credible person that has a lot of influence and getting them to say, actually, this is great and it works.
Yeah.
So that's one technique, and there's a whole host of techniques you can use. So we looked at all the barriers, and we found that the main barriers that they're facing are the time, the cost of it, the knowledge of how to do it, the knowledge of why it's important, the motivation, the capability, like having the skills to do it. And that's the mapping process, is you go, here's my audience, here's my behaviour, these are all the things stopping people from doing the behaviour.
Yeah.
How do I reduce those barriers? How do I get rid of those hurdles?
So what were the findings? What was the result of the...
Yeah, so we haven't, it's still in the process of being published, but what we found was that after 30 days of engaging in this, it was a really small sample. This was a proof of concept study. So the idea was, does this work, yes or no? If it does, then you invest in a much larger study to really figure out how it's working.
Yeah.
But we had a small group of 26 students, and 24 of them completed, which is really high for an intervention. So generally you have attrition, you have dropout. And what we found is that actually 90-something% of people engaged and were retained until the very, very end. The other thing was not just will they stay until the end, will they actually do the daily behaviour? And most of them did. So in retention, engagement, really, really high, which is really promising. Students can do it, and they can do it consistently enough every day for a month. Then we looked at the mental health outcomes, and we saw that it significantly, from beginning to end, significantly reduced the severity of their symptoms of depression, anxiety, and stress, all three. Okay. Which, if anyone's ever been a student before, or if anyone remembers being in their early 20s,
it's a high-stress time.
It's a really high-stress time, and it's when you're really vulnerable to experiencing things like depression and anxiety.
Yeah.
And then my favourite bit was every single person that was in the study had what we call severe PRU, severe problematic internet use.
Okay.
By the end of the study, the 24 out of the 26 who'd completed, not one of them met the threshold for severe problematic internet use. Every single one of them, their severity had dropped so low that they did not meet that criteria anymore. And any good behavioural scientist or psychology scientist will tell you it's not enough to just look at what happens right at the end of the treatment.
Sure.
If you want good outcomes, you've got to look at what happens a month, 2-3 months afterwards.
Yeah.
We checked in with them again, and they hadn't gotten worse. They had stayed exactly where they were. So none of them had gotten worse with their internet use. None of them had gone back to that severe threshold. Okay. They'd all maintained that level of improvement, which is really exciting.
That's a good news story.
Yeah.
Kavya, thank you very much.
No, thank you for having me. Happy to be here, Jeff.
Great.